Of the various problems relating to extinct forms of man, none is of greater interest than that which concerns Homo neanderthalensis. This peculiar and extinct species of man appeared in Europe about the commencement of the Mousterian cultural period, and all traces of him vanished towards the close of that period. Where he came from and where he finally disappeared we do not know, hence every additional fact we can collect about him is of value. It begins, as so many of these stories do, not with a grand theory or a sweeping claim about human origins, but with something far smaller and far more fragile. A child, less than a year old, placed carefully into a hollow in the wall of a cave, as if someone 50,000 years ago had paused, knelt down, and made a deliberate decision about how this life, so brief, so incomplete, should be remembered. What makes this moment unsettling is not simply the act itself, but the context in which it exists, because this was not a modern human burial, one attributed to Homo neanderthalensis, a population that has long been framed as separate, distant and fundamentally different. And yet here, in the dim interior of Amud cave, something does not quite fit that narrative. Homo neanderthalensis, alternatively Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, was a late archaic form of Homo sapiens that diverged from modern human lineages no earlier than 500,000 years ago and had largely disappeared from Europe and Asia by 39,000 years ago. The child in question, known as Amud 7, was discovered not scattered or broken apart as one might expect from natural processes, but articulated, the bones still aligned in a way that suggests the body had been placed intact into the earth, shielded from disturbance, preserved in a quiet, almost intimate setting along the cave's north wall. The position itself is telling, the infant laid on its side in a small niche, a location that feels less like a random deposit and more like a chosen resting place, a space set apart from the chaos of daily life, and perhaps more significantly, a space that may have been used more than once, since nearby fragments of another infant were also found, hinting at repetition, at memory, at something resembling tradition. What deepens the mystery is not only the placement of the body, but what was placed with it, because resting directly on the child's pelvis was the jawbone of a red deer, positioned in a way that resists easy dismissal as coincidence. It is a detail that forces interpretation, that invites the uncomfortable possibility that this was intentional, that someone selected that object and placed it there, not for practical reasons, but for symbolic ones, perhaps as an offering, perhaps as protection, or perhaps as part of a belief system we can only partially reconstruct. When archaeologists encounter such arrangements, they are cautious, often reluctant to assign meaning where natural processes might suffice. But in this case, the context, the articulated skeleton, the niche, the repeated use of the space, pushes against purely natural explanations and begins to suggest something more structured, more deliberate. Yet even as the burial itself raises questions about behavior and belief, the body of the child introduces an entirely different layer of complexity, one rooted not in culture but in biology, because Amud 7 is not simply another Neanderthal skeleton, but one of the most complete infant remains ever recovered, comprising over 100 skeletal elements that allow for an unusually detailed reconstruction of early development. And what emerges from that reconstruction is not what one might expect if Neanderthals were simply a slightly different version of modern humans, because the proportions of this infant do not align with modern developmental patterns in any straightforward way. Based on dental evidence, particularly the eruption and formation of the lower incisors, the child appears to have been around 6 months old at the time of death, a conclusion grounded in well-established methods of estimating age in both ancient and modern populations. But when researchers examined the long bones, the limbs, and the overall body size, a discrepancy emerged that could not be easily explained away, because the skeletal development corresponded not to a 6-month-old, but to that of a modern human infant closer to 12 or even 14 months of age. In other words, this was a baby whose teeth said one thing, but whose body said something entirely different, suggesting that growth in Neanderthals did not follow the same synchronized patterns seen in our own species. This divergence is not trivial, nor is it easily dismissed as individual variation, because similar patterns have been observed in other Neanderthal children, including specimens from Western Europe and the Levant, where again the teeth indicate one age while the body suggests another, pointing toward a consistent developmental strategy rather than an isolated anomaly. The implication is that Neanderthals experienced accelerated somatic growth early in life, building larger, more robust bodies in a shorter period of time, while dental development proceeded at a slower or more conserved pace. Such a pattern carries significant physiological implications because rapid growth is energetically expensive, particularly in environments that are already demanding, and it suggests that Neanderthal infants required substantial nutritional support during the earlier stages of life. This, in turn, raises questions about social organization, about caregiving, about the ability of small groups to consistently provide the resources necessary to sustain such growth, especially in the often harsh and unpredictable climates of Pleistocene Eurasia. If these infants were growing faster, becoming physically larger sooner, then their survival depended not only on biology, but on the capacity of their communities to meet those demands, to protect, feed, and perhaps even prioritize the youngest members of the group. And yet, even as we consider these biological differences, we are pulled back to the burial itself, to the act of placing this child in a niche, to the red deer jaw resting on its pelvis, to the possibility that this was not an isolated gesture, but part of a broader pattern that extends across multiple sites and multiple generations. Because Amud is not alone in presenting such evidence. To the north, in Dedier Cave, another infant was found, this one even younger, perhaps only a few months old, laid on its back with arms extended and legs flexed, accompanied by objects that appear to have been deliberately placed within the grave. In Dedier Cave, a subrectangular limestone slab was positioned near the head, while a triangular flint piece rested above the chest, embedded within a layer of soil that differs from the surrounding deposits, suggesting that the burial pit was intentionally prepared and filled. The arrangement is precise, almost careful, the body positioned in a way that implies attention rather than haste, and the objects placed in locations that seem to carry meaning, even if that meaning remains opaque to us. What is striking when these sites are considered together is not only the presence of infant burials, but the consistency in how those burials are carried out, the repeated use of certain positions, particularly the flexed or fetal posture, a configuration that echoes burial practices seen in much later human populations. The recurrence of this posture across different regions, West Europe and the Levant, suggests that it was not a random choice, but a shared convention, one that may have been passed down through generations, preserved in memory, and enacted with a degree of continuity that challenges the notion of Neanderthals as purely instinct-driven or behaviorally simplistic. If anything, these burials force us to confront a deeper question, one that is difficult to answer precisely because it sits at the intersection of biology and culture. What does it mean for a population to treat its dead, particularly its infants, in this way? Because the death of a newborn or a very young child, while undoubtedly tragic in any human context, does not carry the same social weight as the death of an adult, especially in small mobile groups where survival is precarious and resources are limited. And yet, despite these constraints, we see evidence of care, of placement, of objects that carry symbolic significance, suggesting that even the briefest lives were not ignored or discarded, but acknowledged in some meaningful way. This is where the tension becomes most apparent, because the same skeleton that reveals clear anatomical differences, no chin, robust jaw attachments, a distinct foramen magnum shape, also participates in behaviors that feel, at least at a superficial level, deeply familiar. The infant from Amud displays traits that firmly place it within the Neanderthal lineage, traits that appear early in development and are unlikely to be the result of environmental factors alone, indicating a genetic foundation for these differences. And yet, the way the body was treated after death aligns with practices that we associate with symbolic thought, with ritual, with an awareness of mortality that extends beyond immediate survival. The challenge, then, is not simply to catalogue these differences or similarities, but to understand how they coexist, how a population can be both distinct in its biology and yet comparable in its behavior, and whether the categories we impose, Neanderthal versus modern human, separate species versus shared lineage, are sufficient to capture that complexity. Because when we look at Amud 7, We are not just looking at a data point in a developmental study or a single burial among many, but at a convergence of evidence that resists simple classification. There is also a temporal dimension to consider, because the burial dates to a period roughly between 50 and 60,000 years ago, a time when different human populations were interacting, overlapping, and in some cases interbreeding across Eurasia. The Near East, in particular, serves as a kind of crossroads, a region where Neanderthals and early modern humans appear to have alternated or coexisted at different times, leaving behind a complex archaeological record that does not always resolve neatly into discrete phases or populations. In this context, the Amud infant becomes part of a broader landscape of interaction, a landscape in which boundaries are porous and identities are not always clearly defined. In fact, other fossils in the Levantine region show morphological and cultural overlap, blurring the line between sapiens and Neanderthals. The Theban woman burial, dated to about 150,000 years ago, has blurred morphology, suggesting a hybrid ancestry. The Cabrera Neanderthal was buried in the exact same fetal position as the Skulkafzir modern humans, suggesting cultural overlap. The adult Neanderthal Amud 1 cranium and skeleton show mixed traits, overlapping with Skul 5 Homo sapiens who lived around 100,000 years ago. Amud 1 has the largest cranial capacity, around 1,700 cubic centimeters, of any Neanderthals ever discovered, and stood about 5 foot 10 inches, with a gracile build unlike his Western Neanderthal kin. What does this mean? This is where the narrative begins to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, from a focus on difference to a recognition of continuity, not in the sense of erasing distinctions, but in acknowledging that the lines we draw may be more fluid than we assume. Because if Neanderthals buried their infants with care, if they placed objects with them, if they repeated these practices across generations, then we are forced to reconsider what we mean when we talk about symbolic behavior, about culture, about what it means to be human in a deeper, more fundamental sense. At the same time, the biological evidence from Amud 7 continues to pull in the opposite direction, emphasizing divergence, highlighting developmental patterns that differ from our own, suggesting that even at the earliest stages of life, Neanderthals followed a trajectory that was not identical to that of modern humans. The accelerated growth, the robust skeletal features, the early appearance of characteristic traits all point to a distinct evolutionary pathway, one shaped by different pressures, different environments, and perhaps different constraints. What complicates matters further is that these differences do not persist uniformly across the entire lifespan, because by later childhood, the growth trajectories of Neanderthals and modern humans appear to converge, resulting in adults who are broadly similar in size, though differing in proportions and robustness. This pattern suggests that the divergence is most pronounced in early life, a period that is often less visible in the fossil record due to the rarity of infant remains, making specimens like Amud 7 particularly valuable. And yet, even as we attempt to reconstruct these developmental pathways, we are reminded of the limitations of our data, of the small sample sizes, of the fragmentary nature of the record, and of the possibility that what we are seeing may not represent the full range of variation within Neanderthal populations. Researchers themselves are cautious, emphasizing the need for more evidence, for additional specimens, for a broader comparative framework that can account for regional differences and ecological variability. Still, the patterns that do emerge are difficult to ignore, particularly when they align across multiple sites and multiple individuals, suggesting that we are not dealing with isolated anomalies, but with a consistent set of traits and behaviors that define, at least in part, what it meant to be a Neanderthal child. And when those traits and behaviors are placed alongside the burial evidence, the result is a picture that is both clearer and more complex than the simplistic narratives that have often dominated discussions of human evolution. Because in the end, the story of Amud 7 is not just about growth rates or skeletal morphology, nor is it solely about burial practices or symbolic behavior, but about the intersection of these elements, about how biology and culture interact, reinforce, and perhaps even shape one another over time. It is a story that resists easy categorization, that challenges assumptions, and that invites us to reconsider the frameworks we use to understand our own past. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all is that, despite the passage of tens of thousands of years, despite the differences in anatomy and environment, there is something in that small niche in the wall of a cave, in the careful placement of a child and a deer jaw, that feels uncomfortably close to something we recognize, something that blurs the boundaries, and leaves us with a question that does not have a simple answer, not whether Neanderthals were like us or different from us, but whether the distinction itself is as clear as we have been led to believe. Now we leave you with the wise words of Sir Arthur Keith, written in 1921. The most marvellous aspect of the problem raised by the recognition of Neanderthal man as a distinct type is his apparent sudden disappearance. He is replaced with the dawn of the Aurignacian period by men of the same type as now occupy Europe. What happened at the end of the Mousterian period we can only guess. The one thing we are now certain of is that he was not suddenly converted into the modern type of man. And with that statement we leave you to ponder the mysteries of our shared human history. Until next time, stay curious and stay questioning. Also, please subscribe, share and explore our channel's other videos. Thank you, and take care.